So I have a few thank yous to say. First of all, I just want to thank everyone in this room and the entire Lincoln Douglas community. We really foster civil disagreement, and we can really talk and argue about issues in a civil way. And I think that just strengthens our whole community and our whole country. So then I want to also thank my coaches. This year has been the most challenging, personally, with so many things going on. And I've been pulled in so many different directions, but throughout, my coaches have really been very understanding and really helped me along the way. I also want to thank my teammates who've been very helpful throughout the entire process, whether it's researching or just teaching me how to be a better leader. And then I just want to thank my parents who have always been there. They pour so much into my cup, and it really takes a village.
So I want to also thank the entire Lincoln Douglas community. When I came here 4 years ago, starting off as a scared 14-year-old girl, I never knew just how much this activity would mean to me, just how much I would get to know everybody in this community, just how much I would be able to evolve and become better because of all the people who I've debated with, I've debated against, all the people who have judged me. So I just want to thank you all for supporting me in that journey because it's meant so much to me. I want to thank my entire team. They've been so supportive over the course of the years that I've been on with them. With all the practice debates, all the practices we've done, all the conversations, all the support, even when I was struggling. I think that my team is just the best in the world. I want to give a special shout out to the coaches because they've done so much for me. And of course, to my parents for driving me at 5 a.m. to a parking lot in the middle of Illinois so that I could get on a bus and come back at some indeterminate hour just to do this. I've been so grateful, and I'm so grateful for all of you. My heart is just so full knowing that I got to be a part of something so much bigger than me that taught me so much and that made me so much, and all of you contributed so much to that. So I want to thank you all.
Coaches ready?
Yes.
Opponent. I affirm that the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States ought to be term limited. My value is democracy. Bajaj 22. Democratic decision-making best protects rights because it is more responsive to their preferences than competing forms of government. As groups of people are included in the democratic process, their interests are better advanced in the political system. Thus, the criterion for democracy is accountability. The National Endowment for Democracy 19 explains, accountability is the cornerstone of a well-functioning democracy. Accountability refers to all the different ways that citizens provide feedback. Proper accountability mechanisms provide incentives for governments to work in the best interests of their citizens. My first contention is term limits create accountability, with my first subpoint being regularized appointments solve accountability crisis. New York Times 19. Fewer Americans have confidence in the court than ever before recorded. Only 25% of respondents said they had confidence. That number is down from 50% in 2001 after the court's hugely controversial Bush versus Gore decision. Widespread lack of confidence and trust in the court is a crisis. The court's biggest decisions have always angered one group of people or another, but overall public confidence in the court remained high until recently. Langen 22, with its decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, the US Supreme Court's conservative supermajority has abandoned any pretense of acting as a neutral arbiter of the law. America's rancorous partisan politics have fully infected the court, which is quickly descending into theocratic extremism. When the public is upset, they look towards methods of accountability. Unfortunately, there are too few for the court. These limited options require the reform of term limits to restore legitimacy and accountability to the court. Sherry 19. While the Supreme Court is meant to be insulated from direct political influence and serve as a counterweight to the majoritarian process, the confirmation process is meant to be a democratic check on the court. As term lengths have increased, making nominations and confirmation hearings less frequent, the Supreme Court has become too counter-majoritarian than intended, leading to an imbalance and divorcing the justices' views from the current society's needs. Brennan Center in 2019 finds there's no regularized system of Supreme Court appointments. Justices are appointed unevenly so that some presidents have many appointments while others have few or even none. Because justices now serve longer on average than their predecessors, there are significantly fewer appointment opportunities. These developments fray the only formal link between the court and the people, nomination by an elected president and confirmation or not by elected senators. The lottery appointment system undermines the court's constitutional legitimacy and erodes the court's connection to our democracy. Term limits solved by implementing more accountability. Cooper 22. Term limits blunt the effect of a rise of average tenure. Rather than undemocratic and inefficient random gaps and vacancies present today, routine democratic checks keep the court accountable. Subpoint B is strategic retirement. Second, judges can retire at strategic moments in order to hand their seat off to like-minded justices. This also fundamentally is undemocratic because it subverts election results. Bruning 21. The thing that frustrates democratic control is strategic retirement, which allows sitting justices to select the political leaning of their successors into perpetuity. The court has turned itself into a self-sealed power structure where judges are allowed to choose to retire when the political conditions ensure that they are replaced by someone with their same ideology. These strategic retirements allow the court's ideological composition to go unchanged. The only thing that can realistically cause the ideological composition to change is surprise death, which is rare. President's Commission in 21 finds this kind of strategic calculation, or even just the perception of it, fuels public belief that the system is unfair or rigged because strategic retirements prevents presidents from receiving equal number of appointments. Term limits put a stop to both the possibility and the perception of strategic retirements. The country's future shouldn't come down to retiring at strategic moments. When these retirements happen, it submits the court as completely political and lowers its credibility. No judge should be allowed to choose their successor. That choice belongs to the American people. Impact, O'Connor 08. Properly understood, judicial accountability is a fundamental democratic requirement of our federal and state governments. Put simply, judges must be accountable to the public for their constitutional role of applying the law fairly and impartially. Contention 2 is legal innovation. As society progresses, law also progresses with society, Wegman 22. The original Constitution says nothing about women at all. It was written in the late 18th century by a conclave of a few dozen men, all white, mostly wealthy slave owners. Over 2 centuries, the nation has rejected the worst of the founders' beliefs and values and sought to respond to the needs of a growing and changing society through modern interpretation of the text they created. This is a problem as the current long terms distance judges from accountability to a changing society. Ping 22. Term limits help bring fresh perspective to the court. Legal scholars suggest justices become more distant from the implications of their decisions on the public the longer they sit on the court. In 83, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, term limits would ensure that federal courts would not lose all touch with reality after decades of ivory tower experience. Regular changes in the court's composition can be especially important for bodies where a small number of people hold considerable power. The court will be more representative of the American public's current viewpoint. Gold 20 furthers, ours is the only Western democracy with life tenure on its highest court. That unusual status underscores the need to reconsider the court structure. Staggered terms could keep the court bench more in step with the general public. Today, justices confirmed a generation or multiple generations ago still sit on the bench. And the impact is the Supreme Court will be illegitimate to tackle the 21st century problems. Nimston 20. The 2010 census documented that no less than 87% of Americans were under the age of 65. And experts believe that future scientific and technological changes can be expected to result in profound societal shifts. Yet courts might lack a fresh perspective on issues such as the intersection of privacy, technology, or the modern or dynamics of a modern family. This has huge ramifications on the democracy because if the court is unable to accurately decide on future issues, they've lost their purpose. Finally, contention 3 is legitimacy. View Camp 22. The Supreme Court only has power in so much as people believe it. The court's power depends on its legitimacy and on a widespread belief of both among citizens and politicians that following its orders is the right and necessary thing to do. But the American people are against the current system in our 4 term limits. Associated Press 22. About 2 in 3 Americans favor term limits. Presidential Commission for Supreme Court. Term limits enjoy bipartisan support, and the National Convention of Constitutional Scholars saw support on both sides. For those reasons, I'm urging an affirmative ballot.
Right.
And I stand ready for process.
Putting 3 minutes on the clock. Judges ready? Yes. Are we ready?
Yes.
All right, I will begin now. So starting off, could you read your definition of accountability for me?
Accountability is this is from National Endowment of Democracy. Accountability is the cornerstone of a well-functioning democracy. Accountability refers to all the different ways that citizens provide feedback. Proper accountability mechanisms provide incentives for governments to work in the best interest of their citizens.
All right, moving on to your first contention, you bring up the idea that term limits create this accountability. Could you just read me the warrant for that?
Warrant would be Sherry 19. While the court is supposed to be insulated from direct political influence to serve as a counterweight, confirmation process is meant to be a democratic check on the court. As term limits have increased, making nominations and confirmation hearings less frequent, the Supreme Court has become more counter-majoritarian than intended, leading to an imbalance and divorcing the justices' views from the current society.
So you believe that an increase in frequency of these appointment hearings would fix this problem?
Yes.
Okay, moving down, you bring up the idea of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the conservative supermajority, and theocratic extremism, I believe is the word you used.
That is the exact, yes.
Yes. So my basic question with that is, do you believe that the problem with the Supreme Court now is that there is a conservative supermajority?
The problem with the Supreme Court right now is that there is life tenure.
Okay. What does the conservative supermajority have to do with that then?
I'll happily explain. This conservative supermajority only happening because of life tenure. Why? Because it was because of the random luck that associated with certain justices both dying on the bench and retiring at strategic moments that led to the court having this conservative supermajority. That wouldn't occur in a term limit world.
Deaths. You bring up the idea that surprise death is rare. Could you specifically read me the card that says that?
The card is That card is Grunig 21. It says the only thing that can, that specific part you're talking about, it says the only thing that can realistically cause the court's ideological composition is surprise death, which is rare.
Okay, moving on to your subpoint B, you bring up the idea specifically, I believe you say the phrase that power of selecting who the power should belong to the people when selecting who the next Supreme Court justice is.
Correct.
Then why don't we have the people directly elect Supreme Court justices?
We're not arguing that issue right now. What I'm specifically talking about with the strategic retirements point is that these justices are able to choose their replacements into perpetuity. That is inherently undemocratic.
All right, moving on to your second contention, you bring up the idea that that the justices are distanced from the court. Why are they distanced from the court?
Well, my specific
Or not
card
the court,
talks.
from the people,
Well,
sorry.
my specific card talks about how justices are so distanced because they've been on the court for multiple generations. That's warranted by Gold 20, which say today justices confirmed a generation or even multiple generations ago still sit on the bench, and this divorces them from the society's current needs.
Right, so you bring up the idea that justices are serving longer because life expectancy has increased, correct?
Correct.
Okay, but it hasn't life expectancy increased over the population overall, so how does this connect?
Because they're divorced from the current society's
Right, but
needs
if the
because
current
they've been on-
society is also living longer, then what is the problem if the justices
Well,
are serving
even though
longer?
the current society is living longer, cross-apply my Neiman's 20 card, which showed that the 2010 census documented that no less than 87% of Americans were under the age of 65. Right now, our Supreme Court wouldn't even fall into that category.
All right, those are all the questions I have. I'm going to take 2 minutes of prep time. For a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to be reading the negative constructive, and then I'm going to be responding to the affirmative constructive. I am putting 7 minutes on the clock. Judges ready? Opponent ready?
Yes.
I will begin now. I negate the following resolution. Resolved, the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States ought to be term limited. My value in today's debate is democracy, and my value criterion is promoting stability. For clarity in today's debate, I provide the following definitions. Democracy. Democracy is a system of government in which laws, policies, leadership, and major undertakings of a state or other polity are decided by the people, generally understood to include all adult citizens. Britannica. Term limits. A legal restriction on the length of time or amount of terms an official may hold office. Cornell. Stability. A situation in which something such as an economy, company, or government can continue in a regular and successful way without unexpected changes. Cambridge. As a resolution is about the United States, and more specifically about one of its legal systems, which exists as an extension of democracy, we must assume that democracy is the highest value in today's debate. As a function of such a democracy, or any government for that matter, relies on stability to continue its existence, the only way to achieve democracy is to first promote stability. As imposing term limits on the Supreme Court would act as a hindrance to stability as a function of the democratic government, and weaken its position in the democracy overall, I negate the resolution. Contention 1, judicial independence. The existence of lifetime appointments have come about as a result of the need for an insulated branch that's able to look at the Constitution and review it. By stripping the Supreme Court of lifetime appointments, necessary protections for the court are taken, instability is invited, and as a result, democracy fails. According to the John Marshall Center of Constitutional History and Civic States, the purpose behind instituting lifetime appointments is to reinforce the judiciary's role as an independent branch of the United States government. By giving federal judges and Supreme Court justices lifetime tenure that exceeds congressional or presidential term limits, they are insulated from political pressures that the executive and legislative branch could exert. Additionally, a judge cannot be recalled simply because their ideology has shifted since appointment, further insulating the judiciary against political reprisals from the other branches of government. Mims 2022. This court is reticent, as it clearly outlines exactly what we are losing with the introduction of term limits, that being the protections that the Supreme Court enjoys from the world of partisan politics, as well as eliminating the danger of a justice being thrown out because their views evolve and change. If term limits are implemented, we are allowing for those protections to be thrown out, which invites chaos and instability, leading to a harm of democracy as a result. This is not speculation. As each time a new justice needs to be confirmed, more partisan politics enter into the system. A quote from Vanderbilt University states, the danger of increased instability due to term limits is very real, and policymakers need to take that risk into account when considering the proposal. Furthermore, this reduced stability would fundamentally change the nature of judicial prudential evolution and change the focus of litigants, policymakers, and lower court judges from respecting precedent to focusing on the court's composition. Any proponent of term limits has the burden to show that strategies exist and can be effectively utilized to mitigate these dangers and that countervailing benefits can be sufficiently realized. Sunby 2019. This quote once again makes clear the danger that term limits in specific pose to the Supreme Court and to democracy as a whole, with the instability that they pose. As no strategies to counterbalance these issues can be found, term limits fail at their fundamental purpose. By harming stability, term limits would hurt democracy and could lead to an end of the United States political system as we know it. Contention 2, alternative solutions. There's no doubt that major issues abound with the Supreme Court of the United States in terms of its role in the government. However, if the goal is implied by the word on the resolution is to look at the moral implications in regard to what best promotes stability and therefore democracy, term limits are not the best option. To quote from Buffalo Law Review, most of these proposed changes to the court, whether court curbing measures and imposition of term limits or stylized expansions, are problematic. Most, if not all of them, are questionably constitutional. And straightforward court packing has many advantages over other proposed changes, including term limits. Feldman, 2020. This quote highlights the first major issue with imposing term limits, that being its effectiveness. If you want to promote stability in order to uphold democracy, you must choose the option that is not fundamentally problematic in nature, as term limits are. If the goal of the imposition of term limits is to promote a specific ideological spread, court packing is faster and more effective. Now, as options like court packing have been shown to have major benefits over term limits, it can be concluded that term limits are not the best way to improve the court, and thus will lead to a destabilization of democracy through choosing, in addition to implement a radical and ineffective method of reform, a crucial branch which upholds stability. In addition to options like court packing, there are other non-term limited options that have been shown to have positive outcomes for the Supreme Court. From the Yale Law Review, having the permanent justices select additional justices to join the court is critical. While having justices choose their own colleagues might initially seem strange, this proposal resembles the way civil arbitration often works. There's a look to view that this method is effective at procuring unbiased and fair decision makers. This proposal has the potential to help clean up the toxic confirmation process and reduce the temperature of Supreme Court politics. Act 2019. This provides us with yet another example of court reform that is a better option than term limits, due to the fact that if the goal of term limits is to introduce more fair and balanced justices, this method achieves that better, as well as reduces the likelihood of partisan politics, which term limits only exacerbate. As has been demonstrated, changes to the appointment process or possibly changes to the way appointees are chosen have demonstrably positive outcomes and preserve democracy, whereas term limits do not. Moving on to my opponent's case. There are values are the same, so that can easily collapse. Our value criterions promoting stability and accountability. Accountability is important. I will not argue that. However, promoting stability is more important. We cannot have a government that is accountable if we do not first have a stable government. If our government isn't stable, then it cannot exist. And fundamentally, we cannot have anything be accountable if we do not first protect the stability of our government. Therefore, stability should be the criterion for today's debate. Moving on to my opponent's first contention. My opponent argues the idea that term limits create accountability. I would like to read a card from Farmsworth 2021, which specifically states, if we had term limits, what the court is going to say next year about affirmative action, abortion, federalism, capital punishment, or anything else would be harder to guess, because it would depend on part on how the ping pong balls drop when the next justices are picked. It is useful for actors throughout the legal system as well as the citizenry to have a reasonable, confident sense of what the court's position on various subjects would be in the near future. Slow turnover would create that confidence, and rapid turnover would undercut it. Rapid turnover is exactly what we see in the role of the app, and actually decreases accountability, because justices are able to make these decisions and then be off the court so fast that we can't actually have them be accountable to anything. Moving down the flow, my opponent brings up the idea of that confidence in the court has decreased. I would like to read a card from Gallup polls, which are specifically from Jones 2023. It says 47% of adults have a great deal of or fair amount of trust in the judiciary branch. 42% of U.S. adults have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the executive branch, and only 18% of adults have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the legislative branch. That's from Jones 2023. We can see that the Supreme Court is actually the most trusted branch in the government currently. So why would we want to change it to make it more like the branches, which are at 42 and 18% confidence currently? That is an absolutely ludicrous idea if we want to preserve democracy, as we both do. Moving down the flow, my opponent brings up the idea of overturning Roe v. Wade, the conservative supermajority. I like to cross-apply my card for my second contention, which specifically talks about the fact that if we want to change the balance of the court in terms of ideology, court packing is a faster and more effective way to do this. If that is the main issue with the Supreme Court currently, we have a method that is better and cannot choose term limits to fix it. Moving down the flow, my opponent brings up the idea that the Supreme Court is divorced from the public. I would actually like to disagree with this argument, specifically because of the fact the Supreme Court, I would like to argue this for three reasons. Number one, the Supreme Court are still human. They're not locked in a tower somewhere. They have family members, friends. They go out and experience the world, and therefore are at some level connected to the decisions that they make. My second argument is going to be that of the population age. My opponent brings up the idea that the Supreme Court is aging rapidly, and that's disconnected from the public. However, the public is aging rapidly as well. There is no impact on this argument. In addition, I would like to read a card specifically from Buckfire Law, which is the average age of the members of the House at the beginning of the 117th Congress was 58.4 years of age. Senators, 64.3 years of age. And the average age of a Supreme Court justice at time of appointment is 53 years of age. Which means the Supreme Court is the youngest of the three branches, and therefore the more connected. By changing it, we're not going to be changing it to increase the connection to the public. We're actually going to decrease this. I'd also like to move on to my opponent's subpoint B. My opponent brings up the idea of...
Could you stand ready for cross-ex?
Yep.
Good judges ready?
Yes.
Okay, and let's get started. Okay, you talked about stability. So the country should always be just stable and look at the past and just be a stable country?
That's not true at all. My argument with stability is specifically that we cannot have a country if we do not first have a stable government. We can't look at anything, whether that be quality of life, whether that be
Is radical change
accountability.
sometimes necessary?
Yes.
Would you say right now this current Supreme Court needs change?
Yes.
Then how do you in any way uphold your value criterion of stability?
Well, because of the fact that instead of implementing a system which has actively been shown to not be the most effective option, it would lead
Has
to
court
increasing.
packing been shown to be the best option?
As shown in my cards, court packing is a more effective and faster way of shifting the
Couldn't
ideological
court
balance of
packing
the
lead
court.
to the court having too many justices and it just becoming a partisan fight where a Republican nominates 50 justices, then a Democrat nominates 100, then a Republican 200, and this keeps going on infinitely until the court is a billion people big?
Actually, I could read you the card that I have specifically about court packing, which specifically says that court packing should be capped at 4 justices.
So then that's a specific plan, not a different proposal to the resolution, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
So even in that own card, it talks about how court packing itself is flawed and it only works if there are X amount of caveats. Doesn't that prove court packing is not an effective strategy?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the
I'll
question.
move on. You talked about in your contention one, is this all based on the fact that the court is going to be not going to be stable because of this Sunby card you read?
I'm sorry.
Your contention one about judicial independence, you talked about how there's going to be a rapid change. Is this all based upon your card Sunby?
No, I have several different cards if you would like me to read them.
Which one has the empirical evidence that shows it?
The
Did you read
empirical
that?
evidence, I can actually read you a card specifically
The
from.
one you read in your case.
Oh,
please.
the one I read in my
That
case.
has the empirical evidence.
The one I read in my case was specifically the, yes, the Sunby card, which talks about the fact.
Is the
that
court
it's-
right now upholding precedent and being stable?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, no.
Okay, so if they're not being stable right now, what about negating the resolution would be a better solution?
Well, because if we go with the affirmative, we are locking ourselves into a system which we know is not the most effective option to solve the current problems with the court. Rather than locking ourselves into something like term limits, which we know don't solve the core issues with the court, we
What
actually
is the
allow
core
ourselves
issues
to.
of the court?
Well, as mentioned, the core issues with the court right now can be resorted to 2 camps. 1, ideological balance, and 2, fair and balanced justices. I presented 2 options.
How
which were-
does the court packing lead to more ideological balance when we just talked about how one president could nominate way more justices than another, and this would lead to imbalance?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Okay, what was the other issue? You talked about ideological imbalance, and what was the other one?
The other one was making sure that more fair and balanced justices get onto the court.
So as long as we can prove that more fair and just justice is getting on the court,
Yes.
what about court packing or any other proposal that you mentioned has more fair justice?
Yes, so the specific card that I'm referring to is my EPS 2019 card, which talks about the idea of justices selecting their own colleagues. This is how civil arbitration actually works.
Can you
It has been shown
explain
to
that
produce.
point a little
You
bit?
let
more?
her finish.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This card is actually referring to the way that civil arbitration actually works, and it has been shown to produce more fair and balanced our judiciary.
So for a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to go on my opponent's side of the flow first, starting with the value criterion debate, and then we're going to go on their side of the flow, then my side, so that's NCAC. Hey, is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay, then let us begin. Okay, firstly, my opponent concedes to the value, so we're just looking at what upholds a democracy better. Right away, your ballot should be for the accountability. Why? Because I talk about how accountability is the cornerstone of a democracy. There is no democracy without accountability. But even worse, accountability provides a mechanism for checks and balances in the political system, ensuring that those in power are held responsible for their actions. And it promotes transparency, which is essential for a functioning democracy. These 3 reasons mean that accountability is the cornerstone of democracy, and it has to be upheld. Stability, and I even question my opponent did this in cross-examination, stability does not go first, because what happens when the rule of law is when the stable rule of law is wrong, racist, or promotes injustice? These responses are clear because they show you how even though a system may be stable, it could be actively supporting the worst quality of life and an anti-democratic system at the same time. Only accountability and accountability mechanisms solve. I win the framing debate. On to my opponent's first contention. This is all about stare decisis. I have 2 responses to this. First of all, courts don't have whiplash. 1, all state Supreme Courts have term limits besides Rhode Island, and we never hear about a crisis of stare decisis. Neg overstates and fearmongers. But worse, Germany has 12-year term limits and doesn't see flip-flopping. The judiciary is, quote, independent and enforces the rights provided by Germany's constitution. That's Freedom House 22. In addition, Italy has 9-year term limits and doesn't have this problem. PC Giacomi finds the Italian Supreme Court has acquired a wide range of legitimacy with the constitutional order without overturning too much precedent. So my opponent makes all these reputations, cross-apply what's happening in every single state in this union, cross-apply what's happening in these 2 countries, and every other developed country in the world which has term limits. In addition, the current Supreme Court has already killed stare decisis. Dwyer 21. Many legal scholars say overturning Roe also threatens precedents involving rights other than abortion not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, such as gay marriage, which Samuel Alito specifically mentioned. So my opponent talks about this whiplash issue. This is going to happen for gay and lesbian couples where they were just given their right to marriage in Obergefell versus Hodges a few years ago, and now the Supreme Court is saying, nope, that right doesn't exist. That is the whiplash she's talking about. That's happening in her status quo world. Drop all those points. She also brings up these cards about recall. None of my systems talk about recall. It would still be a term limit. So her recall points drop. She talks about how the instability and how the people need to know what the court is going to decide. But when the people know that the court is going to decide against core issues, against the right for gay and lesbian people to marry in America, against the right for women to have bodily autonomy, that's not a net positive. It's still a net negative. My world is a better. And her point about court packing, I have a response. This is from Fisher 23. As the commission reports, court packing is often used as a political weapon in authoritarian regimes, not in the US. In Venezuela, for example, Hugo Chavez cemented support for his socialist policy by expanding the Supreme Court. In addition, we need to leave this practice to dictatorships where it belongs. The commission reports that notes that stable democracies have retained a strong commitment to judicial independence, and court packing does not lead to judicial independence. So there's a lot of negatives to this. In addition to what I talked about, how can you uphold a stable government when you allow people to just keep nominating more and more justices? This just falls on its face. Onto my contention one. She says, term limits, people need to have a sense of what's going to happen. Classify the fact that people know what's going to happen and it's objectively bad, but there's no democratic check on what's going to happen. So people literally have no recourse. When people have no recourse on what's happening with 1/3 of our government, then right then and there, the democracy is unstable and there's no accountability mechanisms. I'll classify all of my accountability impact. We're looking at this through accountability, and I showed you how there's a democratic check that happens more regularly. On to my subpoint B, she uses this Gallup poll, but again, the Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism. So sure, Congress and the executive might have a lower approval rating, but they have an enforcement to their rules. Congress has no enforcement, which means that Supreme Court has no enforcement, so that means it matters more. Then in my contention too, she said there's still harms, family, friends, the population age, the House. I want you to turn this House and Senate point. They have that regular democratic check of elections. So even if they're getting older, they're still accountable to the public, whereas the Supreme Court just sits on there forever. Classify all of my contention two impacts. This is going to be huge in this round. Since there are no democratic checks, and these democratic checks have to happen after multiple generations, the court is unable to respond to growing challenges that occur. That means the intersection of privacy and technology, the modern family. This means the court is illegitimate, and thus the democracy and accountability cannot stand. In addition, my contention three goes completely unrefuted. People are accepting the term limits, thus you must affirm.
All right, I'm going to take for a brief off-time roadmap. I'm going to be, let's see here, I'm going to be defending the affirmative constructive, then responding to the negative constructive. I'm going to respond to any dropped arguments, and then I'm going to give voters issues. Judges ready? Opponent ready?
Yes. 6
minutes are on the clock. And I will begin now. So starting off with the value criterion debate, again, the values have collapsed. Promoting stability is still going to be more important than accountability in today's debate. And this is why we cannot have accountability if we do not have a government. Stability is the only way to ensure that we have a government to make accountable. If we do not have stability, the government necessarily fails, and therefore we have no ability, we have nothing to be accountable for or to. We need stability first before we can look at anything, whether that be quality of life, accountability, whatever it is. We need to first have a stable government before we can review any of that. Moving down, my opponent brings up the idea that we need stable rule of law. Again, I don't disagree with this. However, we first need to address the fact that the Supreme Court, as it exists right now, has one purpose, that is to review the Constitution and respond to it. It is not supposed to be responsive to the public. It is not supposed to be something that is a political battleground. And that is exactly, as I go down the flow, what I'm going to show you happens in the world of the app. Moving down, my opponent brings up the idea that courts don't have whiplash, bring up the examples of Germany and Italy. I would like to specifically read a card that is from The Hill, which says these negative outcomes are confirmed by nations where judges have term limits or retire early. Scholars have reported that in India's Supreme Court, where justices have term limits, they've shown less independence, more corruption, and frequent flip-flops on major issues of significance. This is exactly what we are going to be seeing in the world of the app if we allow for the implementation of term limits. We're going to be seeing stare decisis be thrown out the window, precedent constantly shifting, and of course, as mentioned, corruption and constant decision-making failures. Let's move down. My opponent brings up the idea that gay marriage will be overturned, that we're seeing precedent be overturned, and specifically quotes from a concurrent opinion from Justice Alito during the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That was a concurrent opinion, which means A, it's not precedent, and B, it's not related to what the majority opinion actually was. Yes, this is a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a sign of things to come. And it's also important to note that though Roe v. Wade was overturned, that's just precedent for over 30 years. That would not happen in the world of the app, where we see new justices coming in and leaving every however often would be the change of term limits. That would be a major issue, and we would likely not see precedent stand for that long in that world. Moving down, my opponent brings up the idea that even if the people know consistently what the court's going to do next, it's not important unless they know that the court's going to do good things. Again, I would like to respond to this with the fact that the court is not supposed to be responsive to the people. The people need to know what the court is going to do next, which is only happening in a world where we have stability and no term limits, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to agree with everything the court does. And that's not always a bad thing. Look at cases like Brown v. Board of Education. That was a widely disliked decision at its time, and later came to be known as one of the best decisions the Supreme Court ever made. We cannot always look at public opinion as the test of what is going to be best for the nation. Moving down, my opponent brings up the idea that court packing has been used in dictatorships. I would like to bring up the idea that court packing has been used in the United States before. So we look at FDR's presidency, and number two, my opponent actually ignores my EPS card, which provides another example of non-term limited option, which would improve the court. That was completely unresponded to, and this is going to be a major impact specifically because it shows that there are other ways that are going to make a more fair and balanced judiciary that have been implemented in real life in examples like civil arbitration that my opponent cannot solve for in the world of the app. Moving down to the negative flow, my opponent brings up the idea that there's no democratic checks in the world of the neg. Again, we have democratic checks. Let's look at impeachment, for example. That's something that we could always do if a Supreme Court justice is acting out of line, and my opponent seems to completely forget that this is a reality. My opponent also brings up the idea that Congress has enforcement, so that doesn't matter that if Congress is older. Again, if the people who are appointing the people on the Supreme Court are, as my opponent would consider them, out of touch with the current public, then the people they appoint are necessarily going to be out of touch with the public. That is a non-impact. My opponent's basic argument that the Supreme Court is out of touch with the public cannot be solved by term limits as long as the other two branches continue to be the way they are. I would also like to once again reaffirm my Gallup poll card, which is that the Supreme Court is the most trusted of the three branches. Why do we want to make it more like the two branches, which are at 42% and 18% of support currently? Moving down, my opponent also brings up the idea that there is a democratic check of elections for the other groups. Again, then maybe implement elections on the Supreme Court. We will never know if that would work because we are locking ourselves into a term limit system, which is not the best option. And finally, I would like to move on to voters' issues. My first issue today is going to be that of stability. Who is going to best be defending the stability, which, as I've established, is the most important criterion in today's debate? In the world of the AF, as shown, we're going to have frequent flip-flops on precedent. And not only that, we're going to be removing one of the vital protections that the Supreme Court needs to do its job. If we remove that protection from the Supreme Court, it is open to corruption, manipulation, and open to not being able to interpret the Constitution, rather than becoming a political contest for those who want to manipulate it for partisan reasons. My second voters' issue for today's debate is going to be that of scope. Let's look at the country as a whole right now. Right now, we have government branches which are severely untrusted, but we have one branch which has consistently over time been the most defended. Why would we shrink the scope of how respected the Supreme Court is by making it like those other two branches? Rather, we should be focusing on the fact that the Supreme Court currently has ways that we can improve it that aren't term limits, and that term limits are only going to seek to make those issues worse. Finally, my final voters' issue is going to be that of magnitude. What's weighing the impacts of the AF world versus the neg world? Looking at the AF world, we're going to be seeing a world where we are introducing a system and locking ourselves into a system which has been shown to not be most effective at procuring either ideological balance or fair and balanced justices. We're going to be making sure we have a system which leads to frequent flip-flops on precedent and destroys stare decisis. And moreover, we are ignoring the fact that we've already demonstrated that the Supreme Court needs the protections of lifetime tenure, and that there are other options that do this better. Whereas in the world of the AF, we are opening ourselves up to opportunities such as court packing, such as having the justices elect their own colleagues, or even having the justice be directly elected. Anything that could do what the AF is arguing better automatically fails in the world of the AF, because we cannot examine other possibilities that might solve those issues better. As a result of this, the neg has clearly won today's debate, and I urge a negative ballot. That's my time.
And I take 145 running preps. Okay, judges. So for a brief off-time roadmap, what we're going to do is we're just going to look at what my opponent just said. We're going to respond to their voters, and then we're going to go on to my side. You can flow that on their side of the flow, and then we're going to go on to my side of the flow, where I'm going to get voters and crystallize. You can flow that on my side, and we're going to start with the framing debate. You can flow that on their side. Okay. Judges ready?
Yes.
Opponent? Okay, let's begin. I have very easily won the stability debate for a few reasons. One, my opponent never responds to my key point that accountability is the cornerstone of a democracy. A democracy doesn't exist if there's not accountability. But more importantly, I talked about how it strengthens democracy, how a democracy without transparency, without accountability, without mechanisms to show the government what is the problem and how to solve it, then democracy as a whole doesn't exist. This is a huge thing that goes undisputed in my round. But even worse, my opponent doesn't respond to the point that a government can be stable, the most stable government ever, and still rid the justice of every single citizen within it. It was Martin Luther King in his letter from a Birmingham jail that said, if not now, then when. It's that type of behavior that is going against stability that ultimately leads to the best quality of life in a democracy. Now, onto my opponent's quick voters, some very quick refutations. I want you to drop my opponent's rebuttal to India. India doesn't have term limits. That point falls. I want you to completely drop my opponent's rebuttal when she talks about how the court isn't responsive to public opinion. Yeah, that's the problem. Right now, Americans are hoping for it. And I want you to go through all three of their voter issues. Stability, drop it. Her entire counterplan is anti-stability. So she wants to play both sides, say that we need stability, but then also offer alternatives that aren't stable, and then also say that the court isn't stable. I want you to completely crossify the fact that every single state of this union except Rhode Island has term limits, and yet we don't see any of these stability issues. That goes unrefuted. That's a big role. Then scope. She says that this 25% is a very high number that she's trying to assert to you, but 67% of people agree with term limits. If people are agreeing with this, then that means that this will become an even higher number. So we ought to affirm based off our own metric. And finally, scope. I'm way winning the scope battle. Just the possibility of court packing should have cast your ballot for the affirmative, because court packing is just that bad. Refer to Fisher. That's a key turn in this debate. Here are the voters' issues of accountability, accountability, accountability. I literally cannot say it enough. Accountability is the cornerstone of a democracy, and it upholds the best quality of a democracy. My entire subpoint A of contention 1 and entire subpoint B of contention 1 go completely unrefuted. The court will have a more regular democratic check, and this means we solve the biggest issue. A key thing that came up in this round is, what is the biggest issue with the current Supreme Court? I have contended to you and proven to you throughout this round that the key issue is that the court doesn't have enough accountability, that it is divorced, that it is a conservative supermajority. She says it only rules on constitutionality, but no, it's ruling on its own views, but the public has no recourse. Affirm so that the public has a recourse and the public can give accountability to this branch of government, which is the cornerstone of a democracy. If the court does not have accountability, therefore 1/3 of our democracy doesn't have accountability, and our entire democracy falls. Your second key voter issue is legal innovation. This goes dropped in my opponent's last case. If the court is unable to respond to the growing and changing needs of the society, it is illegitimate, meaning it cannot meaning it has fallen as an institution and democracy does not stand. I have clearly proven to you how legal innovation is necessary and how court justices sitting on the bench for 30, 40, 50 years simply cannot be legally innovative, which means the problems of today, and more importantly, the problems of tomorrow, cannot be solved by this current court. That alone should have cast your ballot for the affirmative. For those reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.